One of the striking conclusions that we came to is it seems that nobody or almost nobody has actually truly harmful intrinsic values. When people get into trouble doing like bad things in pursuit of their values, it's not because the intrinsic value is bad. It's because the way they pursue their intrinsic value is bad.
Joining me today is Spencer Greenberg. Spencer has a PhD in applied math from NYU, and he co-founded one of the first financial firms to use machine learning. He left finance to start SparkWave, which runs psychology research and builds product based on it, including clearerthinking.org, home to over 80 free tools for understanding and improving yourself. He hosts the podcast Clearer Thinking with Spencer Greenberg, and he's a co-author of the just-released book, The 12 Levers, which covers the complete psychological toolkit for improving your life. Spencer, sorry if I left out a few things, but just wondering, going over that list, how do you have time and energy to do all that, and how do you stay focused?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. I like to be working on many projects at once. I know that many people would prefer to really just focus on one thing, and there's a lot of value in focusing on one thing. But the way my mind works is I'm most enthralled if I can work on multiple projects at once.
And any tips you have, either from your book or otherwise, just in terms of staying focused on the projects that you're doing and not, getting too distracted by other things?
When I was younger, I had a big problem, which is that I would start projects and then after they get less exciting, kind of not follow through on them. I'd work on them for a while and then you're getting into the deep, annoying parts of them, and then I kind of fade away. And the way I solve that for myself is involving other people. I'm very motivated if I know someone else is counting on me to have something done. So that is a solution I used, but that's going to vary a lot based on the individual, based on what motivates you. So some people will be very motivated by what other people need them to do, but other people might be motivated by very different things, like reminding themselves of the underlying reasons why they're doing it, or having very clear objectives or that kind of thing.
Okay. And I guess a lot of people, even if they have things they care about, it's easy to get distracted. Nowadays, even people will just be checking their phone at all times. Do you have any advice there, how to avoid those distractions?
I think it's important to consider why you're getting distracted, and that people actually get distracted for different reasons. For example, some people they're kind of more on the ADHD spectrum, and they find that they just have trouble focusing. And if that's the issue, or trouble focusing on what they choose to focus on, maybe they get sucked into something, but it's not what they choose to focus on. When it's that kind of trouble focusing, what I would suggest is really trying to remove clutter and try to create an environment that is sort of maximally focusing for you. So that could be, turn off your phone during part of the day when you're trying to really focus and work, or it could be making sure your space around you has no distractions in it, is clutter-free. Just trying to have nothing else that can catch your attention so that it more naturally gravitates towards what you want it to gravitate towards. So that's kind of one axis of it. But sometimes people have trouble focusing because of other things, like maybe they have anxiety and they have anxious thoughts that pop into their mind throughout the day. And that's kind of what's pulling them off target, in which case there are a lot of helpful techniques for working with anxiety. Or it could be other things. It could be low motivation. Like you may actually not feel motivated to do the thing you're trying to do, and so your brain doesn't just wants you to do other things. And that's yet another problem. So it's hard to generalize.
Okay. Yeah, now turning to your book, I have your book right here.
Nice.
So I guess I want to start, instead of lever one, just jump right into lever two, which is uncover your guiding foundations. And I know you connect this in the book to your life philosophy, which you call Valuism. Could you maybe describe that briefly?
Yeah, so my life philosophy, Valuism, is not saying how you should live your life. It's just saying, here's one way to live your life to consider that I find useful, right? And so it's just putting it out there as a consideration. And it has two parts. It's very simple. It says, one, try to figure out what you intrinsically value. And by intrinsically value, I mean your most fundamental, deepest values, the things you actually care about deep down, the things you would care about even if they got you nothing else. And then also try to take effective actions to create what you intrinsically value. So that's it. Figure out what you intrinsically value, take effective actions to create what you intrinsically value in the world. That's the whole philosophy. And it's based on what is most deeply meaningful to you, but it can give some guidance, because once you figure out what you intrinsically value, then you say, okay, now I know what I'm aiming for. I'm trying to create that in the world.
And Do people all have such a clear separation between their intrinsic values and their other values? Because maybe for a lot of people, it's just blurred. They kind of just go with whatever people around them are doing, and they don't necessarily have such fixed intrinsic values.
So that's a good question, because the way the human brain thinks about values doesn't cleanly separate between intrinsic values and non-intrinsic values, which you may call instrumental values. So let's just give an example. A lot of people pursue money, like, getting cash, and that's valuable to them. There's lots of things they can do with it. But for nobody, or at least almost nobody, is cash an intrinsic value. And the reason is because if you couldn't get anything else from it, if you couldn't get pleasure from it, social status from it, if it couldn't give you freedom, etc., if you literally strip away all the things it can get you, then it's worthless. It's just paper. And if you couldn't even burn it, in an emergency for warmth, it's completely useless. So once you strip that all away, it's useless. Therefore, it's not an intrinsic value. It's a value, but not an intrinsic value. And because our brains don't clearly distinguish between values and intrinsic values, that's part of why valuism is saying something that's less obvious than it seems, because it's not just saying pursue the things that you think you want. It's saying, no, actually figure out the deepest things you want, the most fundamental things you want that lie beneath all the other things you want. And those are the things to go after.
Right. I mean, I guess even if those exist, should they necessarily just be taken as is? Like, what if a person's intrinsic values seem more selfish? Maybe they should do more to try to change their values, so to speak. Or let's say a person is worried they're in a crowd that might affect their values. Maybe they shouldn't care, because why does it matter if their values change?
In our research on people's intrinsic values, we ended up getting about 3,000 submissions of what people intrinsically value. And we analyzed it, and we duplicated it. We also looked at what philosophers say about what people intrinsically value, and psychologists and political scientists, et cetera. And one of the striking conclusions that we came to is it seems that nobody, or almost nobody, has actually truly harmful intrinsic values. Intrinsic values seem that they're pretty much always either neutral or beneficial. What I mean by that is take a value like justice, intrinsic value like justice. Like, I think most people would say, okay, that's a good thing. Or take an intrinsic value like longevity. People would say, okay, well, that's certainly not a bad thing. Or take even intrinsic value like pleasure, or like having other people hold you in esteem. Those are not inherently bad. There's nothing wrong with feeling pleasure. If anything, it's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with people holding you in esteem. When people get into trouble doing like bad things in pursuit of their values, it's not because the intrinsic value is bad. It's because the way they pursue their intrinsic value is bad. So because of that, I've come to think that we don't really have good reasons to change our intrinsic values. But that's actually just one reason I think we don't have a good reason to change them. The other reason is that on what grounds would you change them? Now, if you were convinced that there might be some objective moral truth that's outside of yourself, coming from utilitarianism or coming from God, that could give you grounds to try to change your intrinsic values. But if you don't believe in some big objective moral truth outside of yourself like that, then I would say, well, on what grounds would you try to change them? Because, well, those are the things you most fundamentally care about. And if there's no objective truth outside of yourself, how would you decide what values to get rid of? Because why would you get rid of the thing that you care about?
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I guess it's still a question, like sometimes when you look at something very closely, it dissolves it a little bit. So the ultimate extreme, like, the Buddhists say the self itself could sort of be like deconstructed. So I'm wondering if people look very closely at their intrinsic values, does that weaken them a little? Or maybe if they really dug into why they have those values, would that make them feel it a little less because they see how it arose just from people around them or things like that?
In my experience, no. Imagine a thought experiment of a robot that's been programmed to only care about fetching you cheese. Now, suppose that you got that robot, which was intelligent, to introspect on what it cares about. And it discovers, oh, wow, the reason I care about fetching cheese is because I've been programmed to fetch cheese. Does that make that value of the robot go away? I would say no. Now it knows why it cares about it, but doesn't care about it any less. It's just like, oh, well, that's the reason that's the only thing I care about. And I think it's the same with us. Like, wherever our intrinsic values come from, and we could talk about that if you want, just simply knowing what they are, or knowing where they came from, or knowing how it got there causally, I don't think changes the intrinsic value itself. And in my experience, introspecting on intrinsic values does not make them go away. It just clarifies them. It just makes them, you're brushing away all the silt around them until you kind of see more clearly what's the intrinsic value underneath your values. Your values often do change when you reflect, because you realize that things you thought were intrinsic were not, or you realize that things you were pursuing were not intrinsic values.
Right. This view kind of is like accepting everyone's values. And you mentioned that people basically don't have bad values. But I wonder, are there cases where it still seems reasonable to try to influence other people's values? Like I could think of an example. I was on a meditation retreat actually, and someone asked, should they become a vegetarian? And the person answered, if you are bothered by it, like, bothered by the issues with animals, then you should consider becoming a vegetarian. But if you're not bothered, you shouldn't. But if someone feels strongly about it and they feel that there's pretty serious ethical issues, let's say with how animals are treated, then it seems like they should want other people to also care about it. And they shouldn't just be like, you just do your values no matter what.
Of course. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't try to change the behavior of other people who have different values. So for example, let's say you had values that were all focused on, let's say, justice. And I had values that were all focused on longevity, just to make a silly example. Right? Those could come in conflict with each other, right? The focus, trying to increase longevity could come in conflict with trying to increase justice, right? Maybe you're trying to create new ways of extending life, but those are not going to be distributed equally. So it's going to actually increase injustice in some sense, or at least increase inequality in some sense, right? Now, it doesn't mean that in that case, that people shouldn't oppose each other and try to work towards, getting the thing that they think is important. Well, of course they should. So I'm not saying that I'm not advocating a sort of complete live and let live philosophy, saying whatever people pursue is fine. What I'm just saying is this is a life philosophy about what you can consider pursuing.
Okay. And maybe if you want to just give an example, could you give an example of some of your own intrinsic values? Maybe the ones that are more unique.
Sure. Some of mine, well, most people we've discovered in our research have quite a lot of intrinsic values, but they tend to have a smaller number of very strong ones, right? So they have many that are at least weak. Almost everyone has some intrinsic value around their own pleasure, for example, but people vary. Some people will have it more strongly, some more weakly. In terms of myself, I tend to have strong intrinsic values around reducing suffering for myself, and my loved ones, but also for people in the world broadly, and in fact, conscious beings broadly. I also have intrinsic values around happiness, which I don't think is quite the same as reducing suffering, like increasing happiness in the world, increasing happiness of my loved ones, increasing my happiness. And I have intrinsic values around truth, believing true things and spreading truth, and also around having a positive impact on the world through my actions.
And when you have a conflict between different values, so, like a pure utilitarian could have a clear system where they try to calculate the utility no matter what. How do you resolve conflicts between different values?
Well, because intrinsic values are a psychological fact about yourself, you resolve them by trying to understand yourself better. There's not an external answer to the question of which intrinsic values you pursue. So for example, imagine you go to a play that your friend wrote, and afterwards your friend comes up to you and they say, so what did you think? And you know that they are going to be extremely hurt if you give your honest opinion, which is that you thought it was terrible and had no redeeming qualities. You know they're going to be really hurt. And you also know that it's not going to help them in the future because you know that they're not really going to take into account and be better off because of it. So it's just going to hurt their feelings. So what do you do? Well, some people's intrinsic values will say, okay, I value being truthful more than I value not hurting my friend, so I'm going to be truthful. Other people's intrinsic values will say, I'm going to value not hurting my friend more than I value being truthful. And that is going to depend on the person. And so then when you're trying to resolve this conflict, it's just about reflecting deeply on yourself and saying, which do I value more? Which of my intrinsic values is stronger here? And sometimes thought experiments can be helpful. For example, you could ask yourself, well, what would make it an easy answer, right? Like let's say I was just hurting them a very tiny bit and they were going to get over in 5 seconds. Would that be an easy answer? I would just tell them the truth? Or would that still be a hard one to answer? And so kind of doing thought experiments can help you kind of figure out more detail how you trade off your intrinsic values against each other.
Is this introspective that they're doing, kind of seeing how they'll feel after they do the action? Is that sort of what they're getting at? Or like, what are they trying to figure out when balancing these values?
Yeah, so what you intrinsically value is not the same as like affect of just how happy do you feel about something or how much you like something. For example, you might really like puppies, but you don't have an intrinsic value around puppies. You don't want to like maximize puppies in the world or something like that. You just like puppies, or you feel good when you see puppies. So liking something and feeling good when you see it is different than intrinsically valuing it. Intrinsically valuing it, I think of it as a very basic operation of the mind, which is you can imagine a scenario and you can assign value to it. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it somewhere in between? It's not binary, it's continuous. And I think this is something our brains do automatically. We do it without thinking about it. And I think that's sort of the part of the mind that I'm talking about.
So you've had a podcast for a while. And I know you also have a chapter in the book about like conversation advice. So do you have any tips when talking to people how to ask interesting questions, both in a podcast and also in real life?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with ordinary life. So in ordinary life, I think that good questions come about by breaking the social script, but in a way that's not jarring or unpleasant for the other person, or at least not too jarring. The social script that we learn to follow has certain rules to it. You know, someone says something, you say something that's like very related to that thing, and you know, you follows a certain rhythm, and you can have really good conversations in the social script, but I think it's more challenging because the social script demands a lot in terms of kind of keeping things smooth, keeping things easy. And a lot of times the way to make conversation much more interesting is to notice opportunities where the more interesting way to go is to not quite go with the social script. It's going to go slightly off script. And that's where the realness lies in this conversation, or that's where more emotionality lies in this conversation, rather than kind of do the smooth, easy thing. So for example, let's say someone is telling you about their job, and when they mention a certain part of their job, their face lights up, right? Instead of asking sort of the automatic question you might ask, you could say, hey, I noticed you seemed really happy when you mentioned that thing. Like, does that thing make you feel happy, and why is that? If that's true, right? So it's a little bit off social script. It's not super awkward, but it's a little off social script, but it lets you cut to something that might be more deeply meaningful to that person. I also find that to be really important in podcasting is I think podcasts are extremely boring if they follow the social script. It doesn't mean that they're automatically interesting if they don't, but I think that that's one thing as a podcaster you have to learn is like how to not follow the social script to try to make the most interesting conversation for your listeners.
Turning to how your book is organized, I know you went through like a lot of self-help books and therapy techniques, but I feel like there are a lot of ways to organize it. And there are even parts of the book, there are like ideas that are relevant in like multiple places, like certain ideas of stoicism. It's relevant in a few different places, I feel like, in the book. So you could have maybe just had like a unit on stoicism, but it was broken up in a few different ways. So there's, I think, like CBT relevant parts earlier on. Then there's a section on like dealing with kind of being okay with things, and then another one on stoicism specifically. So how did you figure out how to organize it?
So our book, The 12 Levers, began when my co-author, Jeremy Stevenson, and I had this question, which are, what are all the psychological strategies you can use to improve your life? And so it started as a big research project trying to answer that question. And we looked at over 100 different self-improvement books. We looked at more than 20 different types of therapy. Every time they gave a method or technique or said to do anything, we extracted it. We made a giant database of almost 500 different techniques that they gave. And then we asked the question for each of them, what is the underlying psychological strategy at a high level that this technique is about? And as we went through it and tried to categorize them all, that's where we came up with the 12 levers. They're the 12 psychological strategies that we found throughout all those resources. So we were really surprised that we could get it down to 12. Now the 12 are very high level, so they're like big groupings, but that's where the organization structure came from. What is the underlying psychological strategy that's at work in this technique? Then we had to think a lot about, well, how do we actually organize the book? Because, okay, we've got 12 levers, but they could come in any order. And so then we thought carefully about, is there a natural progression to them? Are there certain levers you'd want to pursue before other levers? For example, the first lever of the book is about unraveling the deep causes to your challenges. And I think that's the right place to start, because as you learn to understand the causes of your challenges, that actually helps you through the rest of the book with what techniques to apply. Because if you don't understand your challenges very well, you might use the wrong techniques. So we thought very carefully about what order they should go in and trying to make adjacent chapters also have relevance to each other in addition to kind of having natural flow.
Okay, so let's say in the example I gave with stoicism, there are different principles from it, but they sort of fit into a certain progression. And so that's like why it was broken up that way.
Well, like cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, doesn't fit into one lever. It has many different aspects to it that come across different levers. And so we're not chunking it by, okay, where does cognitive behavioral therapy fit? Because that's too big a thing. we're thinking much more granularly. So, of course, at some point in the book, we have to introduce cognitive behavioral therapy for the first time, but that's not because cognitive behavioral therapy is in that lever. It's because we want to introduce a technique from cognitive behavioral therapy, and that's the right time to bring it up. Same goes for Stoicism, right? Stoicism most closely fits into choosing your attitude, but again, it's kind of a broad set of things.
Was there something that you found and that you included in the book that you just think is very useful, but like really not widely known at all, and like it's not famous and people don't know about it?
One technique that's really not well known, that's really useful for people that worry a lot, like myself, I tend to be a worrier, is a technique called worry time. And the basic idea is that people who worry a lot tend to believe that worry is useful, that's solving a problem for them. They also tend to believe that they have no choice but to worry. It's going to happen no matter what they do, and they can't stop it. And worry time really challenges these beliefs and can be really useful. The basic concept is you don't have to do it, indefinitely, but let's say you decide to do it for 3 days or for 1 week. You say, okay, today, every time I worry, if I haven't had that worry yet today, I'm going to write it down, just quickly jot it down in a notepad. If I've already had that worry today, I don't need to jot it down. And then I'm then just going to go back to whatever I was doing, knowing that later at a specific time, let's say 5:30 that day, you're going to take out that notepad of all the worries and you're going to worry about them then. So you're not avoiding the worry, you're simply deferring it. You're saying, anytime I worry, I'm going to delay it. I'm going to write it down, I'm going to delay that worry till later in the day at that specific appointed time, your worry time, and I'm going to do all my worrying then. And then if I get bored during that time, after I've worried, I can also switch to something like problem solving, where I can pick some of the worries and I can work on trying to develop a strategy to solve them. And the fascinating thing when people do this is they tend to find that they have more ability to defer their worry than they realized. They also tend to realize doing this in an experiential way that the worry isn't that useful. Because when they batch it all and they say, okay, it's 5:30, I'm going to do all my worry now, and they sit down to do their worry, I think they tend to see, oh yeah, this is not really doing that much for me when I'm like thinking about, when I'm actually doing it consciously in like a metacognitively aware way. And actually the problem solving is way more effective. So it can be a really useful and powerful intervention for worriers.
It's interesting how that works, because probably they know that the worrying isn't helpful. The brain wants to do it anyways for whatever reason. How does it convince the brain when you say, I'll do it later? Like, how does that work? And the brain just gives in and it's like, okay, I'm not going to worry now all day until that time. It's like kind of surprising.
Well, a lot of worriers actually believe that worrying is really useful. It's a very common belief among worriers. And it's not completely wrong. Like sometimes worry is useful. Like if you're lying in bed, about to go to sleep, and you hear a really loud thump outside of your room, and you start worrying about it, yeah, that's probably useful. But if you continue worrying about it for 2 hours, that's not useful. You should either be deciding that it's safe and go back to bed, or you should go check on it, or you call the police or whatever. But if you're still worrying 2 hours later, then it's not useful, right? So it's not that worry is completely useless. It's that people who worry way overestimate the value of worry typically. But you're right to point out that even if you think, oh, no, worry is not useful, it doesn't make your worry suddenly stop. The idea of the technique is that as you do this, you will actually start to notice, hey, I had a worry. I'm going to write it down in my notebook. Maybe it comes back 2 minutes later. That's fine. You just remind yourself, oh, I already worried about that. I can let that go. And then it comes back 2 minutes later and you're really tempted to worry about it. And then you're like, oh, no, wait, but I know I'm not going to worry till 5:30. I'll deal with it then. And then it comes back again 2 minutes later. So actually the worry time technique has multiple benefits. And another benefit of it is it can make you more aware of how often you worry. And it can help you practice a really useful skill where you step outside the worry and kind of put it off to the side and say, I'm not doing that right now. So you actually train yourself through the technique to gain more distance from your worries.
Does it work for other negative emotions more generally, like rumination or things like that?
So rumination and worry are closely related. Sometimes those words are used to mean things about the future would be worry and things about the past would be rumination. But there can be overlap. Also, worry tends to be more associated with anxiety, whereas rumination tends to be more associated with depression, although there's overlap there too. So, but yes, it could work with rumination. It could work with any kind of thinking where you kind of get stuck on a thought. You could practice worry time. It doesn't have to be a pure worry.
You mentioned how many books you went through and how many techniques you went through. What was something you left out from the book that you think maybe was important but just didn't make the cut?
So something we left out that I wish we had put in, I wish we had had a little bit more on identifying harmful people in your life. and what to do about those kinds of situations. I do think that's really important, and it's been important for me, but somehow didn't make it in the book. So.
Yeah, that's interesting because that's more of like an external circumstance, and most of the book I feel like is very focused on internals. So I wonder if that affected it.
And you could make that argument. Maybe it doesn't belong in the book. It's sort of on that cusp of like, well, it's maybe you could say it is a psychological strategy for identifying when someone's having harmful effects on you. But then it's like, yeah, but it's also kind of more about your environment. Yeah, so it's borderline. But I do think it's very important.
What about more on like rationalist techniques? And I know you have a little on problem solving, but going into more detail about problem solving.
Yeah, so the book is not so focused on rationalist techniques, except where they like heavily overlap with, psychological strategies for self-improvement. There's a little bit like pre-mortem technique. I think we talk about that in the book, where the idea basically is, suppose you have a project or goal, you can, before it starts, imagine that it's already failed and then ask yourself, well, why did it fail? What's the most likely reason it failed? Imagining it failed. And that can be really useful for like preventing a problem before it happens. Problem solving techniques, we don't go into too heavily in the book as a sort of specific technique of here is problem solving. But I would say a whole bunch of the book sort of indirectly deals with problem solving, right? A lot of it is how do you solve problems, but we're trying to give you really specific techniques rather than super general techniques. So rather than teaching like, here's one mega hammer for hitting problems, it's like, here are lots of little hammers that are designed to solve very specific types of problems, because we want to give you sort of like the right tool for the job rather than just a very big, broad tool.
Right. One other thing, I think I didn't see anything about flow in the book. I might have missed it because I think that was one of the books you researched. So I'm wondering how come it didn't make the cut to be included.
Yeah, it's a good question. So for those that don't know, flow is basically the idea that during certain kinds of activities, you can get so wrapped up in them that the time kinds of disappears, and it tends to be a kind of very positive state. You're really engaged, you're focused, you're in flow, as they say. And the kinds of activities that tend to produce it are ones that are like somewhat challenging, but not so challenging that you're struggling, but not so easy that you're going to get bored. And you have sort of a goal in these kinds of activities typically, and you're usually not getting distracted during these activities. I think that flow, as a self-improvement technique, I don't know. I think it could in theory work as a self-improvement technique if you're like, okay, let's try to design your environment for optimal flow or something like that. But to me, it's a little bit harder to execute as a self-improvement technique per se, although I could see the argument that we could have tried to slot it in. But I think of it as more a life design thing of like, okay, yeah, it tends to be people who have lives where they tend to get in flow a lot tend to be happier.
Right. Yeah, I had actually an episode on flow, and I read the book Flow in it, and there it's like, this is the key to all happiness. I think it maybe is just one aspect. I'm sure there are people who are happy who never get into states of flow really. So yeah, I think it varies a bit.
Well, it's kind of ironic because they say that you like lose your track of time when it's happening. So it's kind of funny if like, because I think that there's ways to experience a great deal of happiness that are almost the opposite, where you're super focused on the flow of time. Let's say you're drinking a cup of your favorite coffee, and you're just super locked in on the way it tastes, the way it smells, feeling gratitude for the fact that you can have this coffee, savoring the taste of it, thinking about the meaning of the coffee. You're really, really focused on what's happening and not losing your sense of time at all, right? So yeah, I definitely don't think it's the root to all happiness by any means. I think that's a huge exaggeration. I think it is something that tends to happen in happy people's lives.
I know your book was like very rigorous, and you tried to like evaluate what has enough evidence and leave out things that there isn't evidence for. Psychology had the replication crisis. Maybe it's improved somewhat, but how are you able to evaluate, looking at studies, what really seems to be like high quality and which things, were more questionable?
Absolutely. So psychology had a huge replication crisis where I would say maybe 40% of papers in top journals from about 20 years ago wouldn't replicate. So you went and redid the experiment from scratch, you wouldn't necessarily get the same result. One very nice way around that is you look at work where other teams have replicated it. And if you look in many of the techniques, not all, but many of the techniques we teach in our book, they have been replicated by multiple teams, right? So the independent groups have replicated them. So for example, a lot of the work around cognitive behavioral therapy or ACT or exposure, these kinds of things, yeah, you've got just tons of studies from many different groups that show the effects. So that's one way around it. In general, though, you can also look at the quality of the work. It's not, there's certain signs, I should say, that definitely make work less reliable. And so that's kind of one thing you can learn to discern what sort of studies are ones that tend to be more reliable, which ones tend to be less reliable.
And then I guess, is there a question, maybe certain things fit well, with these like random controlled trials and certain things don't fit as well. And maybe there's important life advice and maybe even like ancient wise traditions and things like that, but you can't really study it in the same manner. Like maybe it takes longer than a typical study, or maybe it's only for certain people, so it won't show up as well. Is there any way to still include that within your book or a way to evaluate it?
Yeah, we do include some things like that in our book. It would be wonderful if there were like really high quality randomized control trials by multiple teams on every single method that exists, but that's just not the case. And there's lots of stuff that hasn't been well studied, but it might be promising. So we brought sort of three lenses to this. We brought the lens of randomized control trials, what's really been demonstrated, and other high quality studies, but that has gaps, lots and lots of gaps. We also brought the lens of my co-author, Jeremy Stevenson, who is a clinical psychologist who treats patients every day. And that gives him a lot of understanding of what works in practice in a different way, not in the sense of a randomized control trial, but he's doing things with his patients and he's seeing how they react and he's seeing what uptakes and stuff like that. So that supplements it. And then the third lens is my own work at Clear Thinking, where I've run over 100 studies on psychology. I've built, I think it's about 90 tools at this point, teaching people psychological concepts and other concepts. So I would just have a lot of on the ground work of, what do people seem to find valuable? What do people seem to be able to learn effectively, et cetera, et cetera? And so bringing that experience. So we also brought our own experience to bear with a lot of, personal data. It's not as high quality as the randomized control trials, but it fills in the gaps because there are lots and lots of gaps. And so you have to do something in those gaps.
Yeah, maybe turning to clearer thinking a little bit. How do you evaluate there how useful the tools are or how useful people think they are?
Well, in the ideal world, we would run randomized control trials on them, but usually that's really expensive and time consuming. We don't have a grant. We don't have grants for it most of the time. Every once in a while, we get lucky and we get a grant. So right now, we had a grant for our habit tool, and we were able to run a big habit study, which was really cool. And we were able to show that our habit tool called Daily Ritual actually helps people stick with their habits better than the control over weeks when they use the tool. So that's really great when we can do that, but that's rare and it just takes so much effort to do that. So what we try to do is get data that's fast and cheap, but still helps guide us. So we generally, for most of our tools, before we launch them, we'll run one study with the general US population, and we'll have people give immediate feedback. What was helpful, what was not helpful. Do you think this tool would be useful if we were to, if many people were to use it? Why or why not? And just get any kind of feedback we can in that way that we can rapidly iterate on. And then once we've taken into account that, we'll generally run a second study on our audience. So we get people from our clearthinking.org audience who sign up as beta testers to try the tool and give us lots of feedback that way. And so that's really useful as well. And we learn a lot. And so obviously, again, it doesn't replace a randomized control trial, but we do learn a lot. And we learn a lot about how to make our tools better. And it gives us a really tight feedback loop.
Right. So I guess it lets you know if people think the tool is good, but it's a much harder question and you can't evaluate it as often as what effect it actually has on their lives.
Exactly. And it catches a lot of problems so that we can fix them before they go into the tool gets released. But it doesn't answer the fundamental question of like, well, what happened? Does it have this impact on your life in 1 month? That's a much harder question. And every once in a while, we can run a study and try to actually answer those when we get a grant for those.
You have so many different resources for people to improve. What advice do you have for people to take them and actually improve and not just like consume it?
Well, for the 12 Levers book, at the end of every chapter, we have key action steps so that it's very easy to find those actions. And we also have a table at the back of the book that actually helps point you to which lever might be most useful to you based on what you're going through. And so what I recommend there is go to the table at the back, think about which of those apply to you, go to that lever and go to the key actions at the end. So that would be my just, very concrete, like how do you find what might be most useful for you. And I'll actually, at our website, 12 Lovers Book, we're also launching a tool that you can try that can help point you to different techniques that might be most relevant to you as well. But there's a huge question of, well, people often don't take action, right? There's the whole issue that in behavior change in general, it's discovered that behavior change is hard. People often don't do things. And also they can get overwhelmed trying to do too much at once. So maybe is that kind of the bigger challenge that you're trying to point at?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there are a lot of people might read self-help books, but people don't change as often as they might read these books. So that's like a much bigger challenge, I guess.
Yeah, so fundamentally, if you're going to change your life, you've got to take action. So for example, if you want to create a new habit, you can go check out Daily Ritual. It literally walks you through creating a new habit. It uses techniques that we've found in our randomized control trial, actually help you stick with it. We've also done a lot of research on why people often don't engage in new behaviors, even when they want to, even when behavior is good for them. And we've studied this in depth, and we created a framework actually for this, which is called the 10 conditions for change. And our realization in studying this is that part of why behavior change is so hard is because a lot of things have to go right for a behavior to change. We point to 10 different things that if all these conditions are met, the behavior will happen. So a lot of things have to go right. And then in addition to that, they'll be different for different people. So one person, the 7th thing might not happen. That's why they didn't do the behavior. Another person, the 3rd thing might not happen. That's why they didn't do the behavior. And so we think about this, and you can find this actually. We have a free website called 10 Conditions for Change, where you can explore this. But that way we think about it is for a given person and a given behavior, you want to look at which of these are not met. And it kind of becomes a diagnostic tool. So to give an example, some people simply forget to do the behaviors. So if that's the sort of underlying cause, well, okay, it has a simple solution. You could add a reminder to your phone, reminders on your calendars, boom, problem solved. But for other people, it's not that they don't remember to do it. Maybe they remember to do it, but they lack self-efficacy. They think, oh, even if I do this, I'm not going to succeed. And in that case, you need a totally different solution. Like simply adding reminders is going to do nothing. So my broad answer is you've got to diagnose why is it the behavior is likely to fail? What are sort of the conditions most likely to not be met? And then you've got to use targeted interventions to address exactly those ones that for that behavior are unlikely to be met.
So you have this book and you have the website Clearer Thinking, and I think you recently also launched some kind of service where people could get coaching. When do you think, assuming someone doesn't have a serious condition, when do you think it's right for them to just try to, do self-help, read a book? And when is a life coach helpful, and when is maybe a therapist helpful? Again, there's no serious condition. They're just trying to improve in various ways.
Yeah. So first of all, I will say if you have a very serious mental health condition, I would definitely recommend seeing a therapist or a psychiatrist. I've seen therapists multiple times in my life. I think it can be really useful. It was useful for me. I talk about this in the book, actually, of how much when therapists help me. I don't think there's any shame in doing that, and many people need that. I think often when you have a more mild to moderate challenge, self-improvement could be a good starting point. You could try it. If it doesn't make progress, well, then you can escalate. You could try a coach. If that doesn't make progress, you could escalate. You could try a therapist. So you kind of think about it. There can be tiers of stuff. There's also different kinds of problems. If you have hallucinations, don't see a coach. That's not going to be the right approach. If you have manic episodes, a coach is not going to help you, or self-improvement is probably not the thing you need. There's some self-improvement even that could help in that case, like maybe making a preparation plan for the next time you have a manic episode. That could be helpful. But in general, you're probably going to need to escalate and see someone who's an expert. So yeah, I would think about it in terms of the severity of the problem and also staging it where you can try the easiest thing first, which is usually self-improvement, and you can go up the stages if that's not working for that challenge.
And I know in the book you cover a lot of different therapy techniques. I don't know if you cover the older fashioned psychodynamic therapy. Do you think there are cases where instead of using the regular techniques like CBT and ACT, people should consider this kind of older fashioned therapy to deal with deeper issues?
So if you're talking, there's so many different therapies, it gets a little complicated. Almost nobody really practices the therapy Freud did anymore, but there are people that are inspired by Freud's therapy. There's, psychodynamic therapies that are sort of taking some ideas from Freud. There's a whole slew of these different ideas. It's not as relevant to our book because we're focused on self-improvement, and those are more focused on things that therapists can do with you. For example, the idea of transference, which is, I think, true to some degree. The way I would describe it is it's the concept that you can play out roles in your life today that reflect situations in your life in the past. Maybe you had a father that never paid enough attention to you and you're always desperate to get your father's attention. And then maybe that can get triggered now with your romantic partner, where sometimes you kind of almost are like replaying that situation and acting like you did back then, trying to get their attention. Or, this comes up in therapy, you might be reacting in a way that's sort of reflective of a past role with the therapist. And then the therapist can try to take advantage of that to help you by using the fact that that's coming up in therapy as a way to try to help you explore what you're doing and why you're doing it, and sort of the underlying psychological motivations going on. So that's kind of an idea, but I don't know how you do it in self-help. Maybe there's some way to do that. So I think the biggest problem I have with psychodynamic therapies is that I think that they, for the most part, are not well proven to actually help specific problems. There are some exceptions. There is a type of psychodynamic therapy that's been adapted to work on specific problems, where it's interesting because when they adapt to work on specific problems, it starts looking a bit more like other therapies. It starts resembling the classic psychodynamic a little bit less, and the other therapies a bit more. But yeah, so there's some adaptations of it. But if you think about really classic sort of neo-Freudian style therapy, it's like, okay, well, where's the proof it actually helps you with specific problems in your life? If you enjoy going to it and you find it insightful, great. But if someone's really depressed, that's not where I'm going to send them as the first option.
Besides psychodynamic therapy style techniques, are there other things that kind of you need a therapist for or a specialist for, and that you can't really rely on like a self-help book for, besides, again, the very serious conditions?
Well, there's certainly a lot of things where therapists can be useful. For example, if you suffer from really intense anxiety, exposure can be a really useful method. And exposure, you can self-administrate, but it can be more challenging. And exposing yourself to things you fear in a controlled way, people can freak out and run away from the fear, and that can reinforce the fear, or they can do it sort of the exposure improperly. We talk about this in our book about what are the proper techniques for exposing yourself to things you fear so that it actually helps reduce the fear. But a therapist can guide you through that and make it a lot easier. So I think there's many, many things where a therapist can be helpful. And so if you have the money or good insurance and you have no problem going to a therapist and you can find someone good, then yeah, fantastic. They can help you with many of the things, and they can even help just set accountability for applying self-improvement techniques. But there are many situations where just working on yourself is not ideal. Like if you're in a really abusive relationship, I think having a therapist can be really valuable because, well, you might be in a situation where someone's actively trying to manipulate you or separate you from people who can help you see things clearly, and having a therapist who can kind of guide you through that really difficult situation or help you see reality as it is if you're being gaslit, I think can be really, really valuable.
There's this famous issue, I guess, with therapy called the Dodo Bird verdict. I think it goes back like 90 years. I think there was a New York Times article about it the other day. And basically it says that every kind of like validated therapy, like not just random methods, but ones that are sort of proven, they're all equally effective. So does that raise any questions, I guess, like if a person's approaching a lot of different techniques, does it just not matter and like any technique that they pick will work? Or is there something that's more relevant to a specific person or a specific issue that they're having?
I think there's a lot of nuance to that result. And I'll just say my views on it are a little bit different than other people's views. So I'll just flag that I have a kind of unusual viewpoint on that particular result. So basically, as you mentioned, they tend to test validated therapies against each other and find no difference in effect, right? Well, what does that really mean? Well, first of all, it's generally not including really wacky things or less proven techniques. Usually they're already setting like pretty well proven stuff and pitting against each other. So already, I think some people want to read the Dodo Bird effect as like, it doesn't matter at all what you do. It's completely irrelevant. You could try to cast out spirits, or it just doesn't matter. It all just does the same thing, which I don't think is true. I think we have to say, okay, no, we're talking about like things that have already been pretty established to work. We're not seeing big effects in the differences. The second thing to observe is that if you're trying to demonstrate that something beats the control group, like you're trying to say, okay, doing this therapy is better than a sugar pill, that is a lot easier to demonstrate than to demonstrate that therapy 1 beats therapy 2 that also works, just not as well. And the reason is because the difference between them is going to be much smaller typically than the difference between a good therapy and the control, right? So good therapy against other good therapy is not quite as good. That's a much smaller difference than good therapy versus control. And when you're trying to detect those small effects, you actually tend to need really large sample sizes. In other words, you need studies with really large numbers of people. And often the studies don't have enough people. So it's sort of like bound to not be able to find a difference in effects because you would need a really large sample of people. And if it doesn't already have a huge sample, yeah, of course you're not going to find. The best you can do is say that they're equal. So that's another thing that I think complicates those results. I would also say that for specific problems in life, we do have quite a bit of evidence that some things work better than other things. So I think that the evidence suggests that among proven stuff, the exposure tends to work really, really well for anxiety. And I would say it tends to work better than a lot of other stuff like more cognitive techniques for anxiety, I would argue. So I don't think it's like we know nothing about what works in it for any situation. I think some specific situations we do have evidence that some specific things tend to work better. The final thing I'll say is that people vary just so much individually. And so it's actually kind of nice that there are all these things that seem to work because there is no silver bullet. Like one thing that tends to work well on average may well not work for a given person. And so it's great that we have other options. They can go the second thing and the third thing and the fourth thing. They're all evidence-based and might work for them when the first thing fails. So yeah, that's my opinion.
You mentioned before that you're working on a tool to help people connected to the book. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that tool?
Sure. So it's an AI bot, but it's not a therapy bot. It's not a coach bot. It's really just about helping people figure out what techniques from our book, The 12 Lovers, can help them in their given situation. So you can describe a situation you're dealing with and it helps you think through what the right technique to apply is. And it helps you actually walk through the technique. It helps you use that technique. That's the basic concept. So it's much more scoped down to compare to this idea of like, let's use AI to solve people's all of their psychological problems. But I think it can be a useful adjunct to the book to help people put it into action.
Is the idea that it will just tell them, oh, you should use, technique 12.1, or will it actually give them more details using the power of AI?
It will walk them through applying it step by step, so it helps them use it.
Okay, interesting. And what do you think about AI bots that are trying to do more than that, AI therapy bots or AI life coaches or things like that?
I think it's at the end of the day, it's what matters here is like how much does it help people and how much risk does it have and how much harm does it cause, right? Like what is the cost benefit ultimately and how does it compare to the alternatives of what people would have done? And I think I think at this point it's a pretty mixed bag. I think in some cases it can be extremely valuable. People can get really helpful insights from talking to AIs. On the other hand, sometimes it can be really harmful. For example, as we know, these bots tend to be sycophantic, which means they tend to support what they think you want them to say. And this is because the way they're trained is in part that if they want users to give it a high rating and saying, that is an answer I like. That's part of the training. And so because people like being told that they're right, they literally get trained to tell you you're right. Now in therapy, this is a really big problem. Good therapists do not go around telling their patients they're right about everything. In fact, sometimes good therapists say, or at least lead the patient to come to understand that they're wrong, that their perceptions are wrong. A core idea in cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, is that often our thoughts are misleading and we can learn to challenge our thoughts. So I think that is a really big problem when trying to use these systems for therapy is that their orientation towards the user is not the correct one for a therapist by default. Now, it doesn't mean someone can't improve that or make a much better one, but I think the out-of-the-box kind of configuration is not ideal.
Right. I think even the general bots have improved a bit since like ChatGPT 4.0, and they're not as bad in terms of...
they've toned it down. They're still, honestly, they're still sycophantic, but it's not nearly as bad as it was.
And some of it, I feel like even with a system prompt, you could tune it a little. And then I feel like if they made, or I'm sure people are working on more sophisticated bots, they would do more than just a system prompt, and then they could address some of these issues, at least to some extent.
Yeah, and I do expect they'll be able to do better than the default out of the box, Claude or ChatGPT, because they can proactively address some of the issues. But some of the issues might also be baked into the earlier training, and so it might be hard to remove it. Another actual challenge of using these AIs, though, is they tend to be very overconfident, and I think that can be a problem as well in these situations, where the bot can state something really confidently that like might be wrong or misleading or just an unhelpful idea, and then people could like actually over-index on it. So I think that would be another thing I'd be wary about. And I think a good therapist is going to try not to give really overconfident opinions that might lead people astray.
Right. And you have all these tools on clear thinking. I know you mentioned the one just now to like guide people which lever to use from your book. But have you thought of doing more, like using AI to like enhance some of these tools?
Yeah, we've experimented with it a bit. In our module on how to have productive disagreements, we let you do like a practice round with an AI where you can practice the techniques on having better disagreements that lead to more productive results. So that's an example. And yeah, we've been experimenting in other ways with the way I think about it is like, how do you use AI to do work that is ideally higher quality than what you're doing now? Because I think the easy thing to do with AI is to do lots more work that's lower quality. But I think that's often where a trap is right now of like people generate a bunch of crap. And I think the more valuable use cases of AI are often do things better than you're doing now. Do more, but do it better, increase quality. And that's always it. But that's a challenge, right? Because AI makes mistakes and things like that. So, but it doesn't mean it's insurmountable. And I think I'm looking for ways to do that. And I think we found some interesting ways to do that. But I'm still looking on the lookout for like, how do we use AI in a way that continually increases our quality?
Right. I mean, the example you gave to help people with disagreements, that seems pretty low risk. Like they're not asking at major life decisions. They're just practicing a certain skill. And AI could probably do a good job, like letting them practice.
And it's a better kind of practice than just like putting in a text box with no response, right? So I think it's a clear win.
Why do you think that society overall and like the education system doesn't really emphasize these kind of skills that much? It seems a lot of what they teach in school isn't particularly useful, and here are things that are actually useful, and they either don't teach it or to like a very minimal extent, and it's not enough to actually help people. Do you have any thoughts about like why that is or what should be done about that?
The kind of institution that school came about through some kind of history that is related to the content that's taught today, right? It didn't start as a place to teach you to be psychologically attuned to how your mind works or be happy, right? It came about as a place to teach you specific things that you should know as an adult and that can make you fit into a workforce and this kind of thing. And then institutions are sticky, and like once things are taught, they stick around, right? And then that becomes a field, it becomes a subject, and then there are teachers of that thing, and then the teachers of that thing work at schools, and some of them become administrators, and it kind of self-propagates. So I think writing, reading, arithmetic, as is famously said, those are all really, really useful. Clearly should be taught in schools. I think some of the other stuff, probably learning psychological skills would be more useful than some of the other stuff. If we really thought about what's the purpose of school now? What do we want it to be? Not just what has it been historically, but what do we want it to be? What are the important skills that we want children to grow up with? There was an attempt to teach sort of preventative psychological skills in schools. And my understanding is that the evidence didn't look very good in the end when they tested it. Like it just didn't help very much. But it doesn't mean it couldn't help, right? It just is like, okay, that particular program didn't seem to pay off. But I do think that there are psychological skills that could help you a lot. It might be a challenge to figure out how to work them in the curriculum, what skills exactly to teach, how to teach them, and how do you make them stick? Because really the purpose is getting people using them in their everyday life. And that's actually one of the big challenges with school in general is like a lot of what people learn, because they don't have an immediate use for it in life, they just forget it in the next semester, or if not the next week. So I think that would be a challenge. If you're teaching psychological skills in school, how do you get them to stick, and how do you get the people using them?
Right. I mean, I think in a way schools used to do more. Like traditionally, if you go back, I don't know, 100 whatever years, they did try to like teach character more. And I feel like that faded over time. And then more recently, they've been doing a little like social emotional learning, but I don't think they do enough to really let people learn. And I think a lot of it would need to be done in a more like real world scenario, and like in a classroom, it just would be useless. And schools just aren't good at figuring out how to like let people practice things in the real world. Yeah, I mean, maybe that's an issue in general. It's hard to like teach someone a real skill when like real skills you need the real world for.
Yeah, schools are not always the best at that. You get all these funny things in math class. It's like, this is Joe's favorite triangle. Figure out the length of the missing side. You're like, what are we talking about here? It's it doesn't always do the best at making it practical. But I think some teachers do a good job at that. But maybe that's not the default.
Okay. And then besides your book, is there one other book or one or two other books that you would recommend to people if they wanted to improve and that you just think are very helpful?
One book that I love is one of my early introductions to psychology. It's for people with depression in particular. Is Feeling Good by David Burns. I think that's a lovely book. I also think if you just really want to deep dive on habits, then Atomic Habits is a great place to start. It has a lot of good, it's a very easy read, it's very popular, and has a lot of good information, basic information on habits. That is a good one.
Yeah, I remember David Burns was on your podcast, and I found it very interesting. Like, there might have been certain things I disagree with here or there, but he just clearly cared so much about like improving and always asking his patients like how he could improve. And he just, I don't know, he had so much like compassion that he showed. So I thought that was like a very interesting episode.
Yeah. And for anyone listening, if you want to check that out, just search for the Clear Thing podcast and David Burns. I've actually done 2 episodes with him, one on how to have better relationships and one on going beyond cognitive behavioral therapy. What are sort of his newer views on how do you even do better and more effective help than cognitive behavioral therapy for people with psychological challenges? And yeah, he's a fascinating person, and he actually popularized cognitive behavioral therapy for the general public. Like, he wrote one of the first books, that Feeling Good, the one I mentioned, that really made people aware of it, and I believe it sold millions of copies, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Okay, so we mentioned some of your resources, but what do you want listeners just to remember? Like, where could they find you, and what should they check out afterwards?
Yeah, so if you found this conversation interesting, we'd love for you to check out the Clear Thing podcast. We also have over 90 free tools you can use on our website, clearthing.org. And we send out also a weekly newsletter about psychology, usually, that we have a few 100,000 people subscribe to that you might find interesting. So yeah, I'd love it if you check that out.
Okay, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.